Welcome, Philip, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Christy, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope I will have something interesting for you to tell you about the Polish market and selling translation rights in Poland. There's a lot of stuff to get through, so let's get going. So, a few words about myself. Christy already said I work at Graal Agency. We are probably, I would say, the largest literary agency in Poland at the moment. I've been working here since 2010, so it's my 7th year with Graal. During that time, I've probably worked on thousands of translation rights deals in Poland, so I've a fair amount of experience doing this. Before joining Graal, I was a foreign rights manager at an Amber publishing house in Poland, so I've also experienced what it's like to buy translation rights, not only sell translation rights. It was only worked there for about 1.5 years, but it was a very valuable experience from my perspective right now. A few disclaimers that I should say right at the get-go. First of all, it's my first presentation of this kind, so I hope just bear with me. I'm sure it will all start going much more smoothly as I get into it. Secondly, this whole presentation is going to be very much focused on what I call trade publishing in Poland. This is not the entirety of the Polish book market, and indeed, you could argue that this is not even the majority of the Polish book market, as just in terms of revenues, in terms of numbers of books sold in Poland. The academic textbook publishers are a very important part of this market. However, we basically don't work with these publishers almost at all, and it's a market that exists almost completely to the side of a traditional normal trade market that we work with, and those publishers also are in general not very interested in translation rights. They produce books for Polish school kids. These are generally books written by Polish authors, and they have to follow specific curricula of Polish schools, etc. So just so you know, this is not something that I can really tell you a lot about. I know something about this market, so if you have some specific questions about this, I'll try to answer them, but this is not my expertise. Third disclaimer, I am a sub-agent. I am an agent working in Poland, and I imagine this probably means that I have certain biases, and my views could be a function of the kind of position that I have within the Polish book market and what my job is. So just keep it in mind. I'll try to be as objective as possible and give you as thorough and as general information as I can, but just keep it in mind. Okay, enough about me. Let's start talking about Poland. So first of all, sorry about the image. I was looking for some image that would represent Poland very well, and for me this is, we're in January right now in Poland, so this is what Poland looks like to me, a bird sitting on the lawn on the street, and I'm sure there are some people in Canada right now who can hopefully relate to this a little bit. It's winter in Poland. So Poland, the area of Poland is, you can see it on the screen, over 300,000 square kilometers, which makes it, just to give you some point of reference, it's about the size of New Mexico in the U.S. It's the 6th largest country in the European Union at the moment. It's somewhat smaller than Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. It's probably the smallest of the large countries in the European Union right now. I think this is how you could describe it. After Poland, there is a long gap, and all the other countries are much smaller. The population is about 38.5 million people right now, which again makes Poland about the 6th most populous country in Europe. So again, we are the smallest of the large countries in the European Union right now. What I think is an interesting statistic about Poland, and I'm not sure, this is kind of what I've been just noticing and thinking about, but I don't have really any hard data to back it up, but I will mention this. The urbanization rate in Poland is at 61%, which is one of the lowest figures in the European Union. And indeed, Poland is very much a country that has population very evenly distributed across the entire territory. There isn't a single huge sort of metropolitan area that would have, a large percentage of the population. The largest city in Warsaw, has population of about 1.7 million people, which is, compared to other big European cities, it's not a huge city. And I think this has a big significance big importance for many aspects of the Polish book market. I think, for example, in smaller towns, you will find many smaller towns that basically don't have a single bookshop, and this is where books and literature basically, they don't reach those parts of the country. So, in some ways, this has big significance for how the Polish market works and what I would call the bottlenecks. And sort of the problems that the Polish market will have to overcome in order to continue to grow. The country is predominantly Catholic, which again has some significance when it comes to the market for religious books, for example. Religious books are something that you can sell with quite a lot of success in Poland in terms of translation rights, but the book has to be, they don't have to be Catholic, but they have to be compatible, I would say, with the teachings of the Catholic Church, and so just keep it in mind. Also, I don't have it here on the slide, but I should mention that the country is very homogeneous when it comes to race and ethnicity, which again has basically we're all white. And this has, if you have any books that are on racial and ethnic diversity, etc., obviously this is not a subject matter that will resonate greatly in Poland. GDP per capita, I found lots of different figures, but this is about right. I think about $15,000 US dollars right now in Poland, which is about a quarter of what the richest countries in the European Union have in terms of this statistic, but it's also about 4 times more than what Polish people earned at the beginning of the 90s. So, it shows the development of a country, and it shows, how far we still have to go in order to catch up with the west of Europe. So I found this website which compared various countries based to various statistics, and I compared Poland and Canada here. So as you can look at those statistics, and some of them may be a little bit amusing. For example, if you moved from Canada to Poland, you'd be much less likely to be murdered, which actually was quite surprising to me. But you'd be much more likely to die in infancy, which would be a shame. But I think the important statistic here is that people on average have much less time, and that people are much poorer, which I think, those two statistics are meaningful from perspective of the book market. People have less time to read books, and people have less money to spend on them, and this is something to also keep in mind, as this is something that I will put in some context in later in the presentation. So the nominal literacy rate is at 99.7%, and I find this to be a very useless statistic, because basically almost all of the developed countries of the developed world have this statistic at very close to 100, so it doesn't really say a whole lot. But I think realistically, this will it's the sort of statistic that gives you a completely wrong idea about what a given country really is. And we have some interesting statistics which are quite gruesome actually, and quite something that it's kind of really unfortunate and almost like frightening when you think about it from perspective of a book industry professional. But TNS is a company that does market research, and they did this research where they asked people whether they have read any book during the period of last 12 months. And the way the question was actually formulated was very sort of generous. So it was like, if you've read a book, or if you read a fragment of the book, or if you even like browsed a book or something, it was very, very general criterion, and 63% in Poland say they haven't. And this is a statistic that has been growing steadily since over the last 20 years, and it's at the record high level right now. So basically, we could probably talk a lot about it, but it just shows that there is a whole lot of people in Poland that basically don't care about books at all, and that is also shows in the next statistic, which I have listed here, which is very related. 74% of people have not bought a single book last year, and people are very free to admit this. There is this, it's kind of socially okay to admit that you don't read any books and you don't buy any books. So that's something that we will definitely, as the Polish book market, will have to work on over, not next 5 or 10 years, but probably over the next 50 years. So I think this kind of helps to explain why, the Polish population accounts, we have the discrepancy that the Polish population accounts for 7.5% of the total population of the European Union, but the Polish book market accounts only for 3% of the combined book market of the European Union. And, as also point of comparison, I was reading those statistics and I was completely blown away by these figures. But, we have a completely almost polar opposite situation in Canada, where almost 90% of the people declare themselves as book readers, and 54% read books every day, which is crazy to me. And, 81% of people declare, actively buying books. So, this combined with the previous slide where you had all those statistics about child mortality, etc., basically, you can sum it up by saying that, Poland's at a lower civilization level of development than Canada as a country. Which, I shouldn't be too hard on Poland. Poland, I was going to have, a section about Polish history here, just so we have, some general idea about this. But Poland didn't have a very easy 20th century, and in general, sort of being located between Germany and Russia, historically speaking, and for geopolitical reasons, that's not the most fortunate location for the country. So we have a lot of ground to make up, and, I think over the last 20 years, the country has been really doing what it can in order to bring itself back to the sort of world of the first world of the countries in the world. So here again, this is just a table that I've taken from a paper on the reading trends in Poland, but you can see the sort of diminishing. This is basically, so in 1994, 56% of people said that they have read at least one book a year, and in 2015 it was only 37%. In 1994, 22% of people said that they've read at least 7 books every year, and right now it's only 8%, which is a disaster. So some general statistics about the Polish book market. We have about 45,000 publishing houses formally registered in Poland, in 2016. So there is a lot of, friends to make in the Polish book industry. But luckily, I think it's very similar in basically all of the countries. Only about 2,000, maybe 2,500 of those companies actively publish books. And out of these, 2,500, only 300 largest publishing houses control about 98% of the market in terms of revenues. So this is kind of the core of the Polish book market that, as somebody who's looking to sell translation rights in Poland, export books to Poland, you will be working with this group of 300 publishers, basically. There is approximately 600, 700 companies that publish more than 10 titles every year. So that basically means that every once in a while you might be able to make a deal with a company that you only heard about for the first time, and you might not hear from them ever again. So this is even for us, we do a lot of translation rights deals in Poland, and we still come across companies that we've not worked with previously, and we still have our first deals with someone, and sometimes those companies continue to do business with us, so sometimes they just disappear. So the worth of the Polish book market right now, I think it was in 2015, was 2.41 billion Polish zlotys, which is about 650 million Canadian dollars, which is slightly less, I think, than what I've seen as the equivalent statistics about the Canadian book market. But you can see, the pretty dramatic fall in terms of revenues since 2011 to 2015, and there are some reasons to explain this. And I think in some ways, the decrease in revenue that can be seen in this graph has largely to do with actually the textbook and professional book market, more so than I think with the trade market. But it's I think in many countries in the world you would see revenues of the book industry diminishing in recent years. So Poland's probably not an exception in that regard. It's not an easy market. Objectively speaking, people do complain a lot, and there is a sense of people are aware of the fact that the conditions are not very easy, but at the same time, I think people try to make best, of the situation, and I think sometimes difficulties are good in terms of making people do things better, and making people focus on what they are best at, and making people improve, and try to make the best of a difficult situation. So there is a question whether Polish book market can be described as a highly concentrated market or not. And I was actually basing this part of my presentation on on a publication by Polish Book Institute, and there will be a website of the Polish Book Institute later in this presentation. So I encourage you to go and visit this website. They actually have a very, very good PDF presentation they do about the Polish book market, which has plenty of this kind of statistical information about the Polish book market, and in much more detail that I'm going into in this presentation. But I think the downside of maybe a problem or difficulty with interpreting this data is that it can be sometimes a little bit misleading. For example, I think a situation like this is in the case of the question of whether Polish book market is concentrated or fragmented. As you can see here, the large companies, which is just a very few large companies in Poland, according to this graph, are responsible for 72% of revenues, and mid-sized companies, which will be the bulk of those 300 that I mentioned earlier, are only responsible for about 25%. But you have to keep in mind that out of 10 biggest publishing houses in Poland that this statistic tracks, only 2 are trade publishers, and they are actually at the bottom of this list. So I think Znak Group is at number 7, and Publikat Group is at number 10. And just the 5 biggest publishers, which are all of them, just basically publishers that publish textbooks for school kids, they control about 38% of the market. So if you think about the market from a perspective of the trade market, or from a perspective of translation rights market, what you will encounter inevitably when working in Poland is you will encounter a market that's very highly fragmented. You will be dealing with many, many different publishing houses, and there isn't really a single publishing house, or even a group of publishing houses that can be said to have a dominant position in this market. So something to keep in mind. You will be likely working with a lot of different companies. Some legal considerations or tax considerations when working in Poland. So VAT tax on books is 5%. VAT tax on e-books is 23%. I think this is quite common for all of the European Union. VAT on books is fairly low, but I think it will be one of the factors that you can blame for the diminishing revenues of the book industry that you could see on the graph a few slides before. Royalty income is taxable in Poland. And if you do actually, once you sell something to Poland, keep in mind that the Polish government will want to tax the income that you make in Poland, and the standard rate of royalties are taxed at the rate of 20% by default. You can reduce this rate by taking advantage of the so-called tax treaties, and Canada has a tax treaty signed with Poland, and so you can use the basic provisions of a tax treaty that override the domestic the local law as far as tax on royalties is concerned. So in order to be able to take advantage of the tax treaty, you have to provide your Polish partner with so-called tax certificate, or I think the full name is a certificate of tax residence. And they need an original copy of a valid tax certificate in order, at the moment they are making the payment. And I believe that if you do supply a Polish publisher with a tax certificate, the tax rate will be reduced to 5%. So it's it's worth it. It's a huge hassle, and and this is something as a sub agent we deal with, and we spend a lot of time working with this. But it's obviously advantageous to not to pay more in tax on your income. Keep in mind that Polish government is very punctilious about everything that has to do with tax certificates, obviously in an effort to discourage people from using them. So the certificate has to be valid, and I'm not sure actually, I think that the Canadian tax certificates do not mention validity date on the certificate itself. So if that is the case, then the certificate stays valid for a period of 12 months. And one important consideration is that the certificate has to be in the name of whoever is identified as the proprietor in the licensing agreement. So if you are a literary agent that does this on behalf of your client, and the licensing agreement says that this is an agreement between an author represented by an agent and the Polish publisher, you have to provide a tax certificate in the name of your client, of the author. If you're a publishing house and you license books in Poland, then you have to provide tax certificates in the name of your publishing house. You can find the link to the Poland-Canada tax treaty here if you want to read through the actual treaty. It's worth to look at it. If you haven't seen it in the past, I believe that the royalties are discussed in Article 13 of the tax treaty, and I'm also sending you another link, which is something that we use all the time at our agency. Basically, the Deloitte is obviously an accounting company, and they have this wonderful resource that basically has this JavaScript application that allows you to determine what are the domestic rates and tax treaty rates between any combination of countries in the world. So if you have any questions about what the tax is without the certificate in a given country for Canadian taxpayers, and what it is if you provide them with a certificate, that's a great resource to use, and they basically have all the information you need in one place. So I do encourage you to use this because it's the most useful resource. A few words about the government involvement in the publishing industry. Basically, Poland is a part of the Berne Convention and has been for a very long time, and the books and also original works that are being translated into Polish are very, well protected under Polish copyright law. Actually, maybe I should just discuss the last point in this slide here. The Polish copyright law basically says that in order to be able to publish, Polish law basically makes a distinction between the original work and the translation of the original work. So in order to publish a translation of the original work, which would be, your book that you have the rights to. Polish publisher needs to have a valid licensing agreement with you. So, it's impossible to publish a translation on its own. And also, something to keep in mind, just, as a contrast with the American copyright law, in Poland, any work of literature is automatically protected by copyright law, regardless of whether, the correct copyright notice is printed in the book or not. It is by default, if an author has written anything, it is protected by Polish copyright law. But basically, the bottom line is that Polish copyright law is up to all the standards when it comes to protecting your rights. Other than that, the government basically pretty much stays out of the book market, which is a good thing and a bad thing. There's been quite a lot of discussion in Poland, about some kind of legislation that will regulate the book market, but so far nothing became of it, and so far it's basically laissez-faire economics and sink or swim. That being said, a government has recently become directly in the textbook market. They basically created a textbook for primary schools that is created and supplied for free by the government, which is again one of the reasons why you've seen declines in the revenues of the book industry as a whole, because that's something that has hit hard the textbook and professional publishers in Poland. In the past, the government used to also subsidize publication of academic books, or basically university level textbooks, etc. But that has stopped, some 5 years ago, and that has also left many, publishers that essentially specialized in getting those subsidies stranded, and they had to retool completely, or they went bankrupt. So there was this wave of publishers that published only academic books before, but suddenly they started coming to Frankfurt, and suddenly they decided they would become, fiction publishers, and they would basically just compete as a regular publisher. So, this is kind of the reason behind it. The government decided that they would no longer subsidize academic books. I mentioned Instytut Książki, the Polish Book Institute previously. Here's the website if you want to go and visit their website. This is basically this is basically a government organization that supports Polish literature and the Polish book market. They do a lot of different activities, but they're also actively involved in promoting Polish literature abroad. And so if you're interested in Polish books, and if you're interested in learning more about the Polish book market, they're one of the first resources that I would recommend, visiting and getting to know. I will say a few things about the distribution market, because distributors are very powerful players in the Polish book market. Basically, very few publishers sell directly to bookstores, or this is a fairly low percentage of their overall sales are directly to bookstores. The majority of business is done via wholesalers, and some of those are really, really powerful companies. Companies like Firma Księgarska Olesiejuk, the second one on my major wholesalers list in the second point, for example. They are some of the most powerful companies in the Polish book industry as a whole. What is an interesting trend that I also should mention is that recently a lot of those wholesalers have been getting directly involved in publishing books in Poland. So, for example, Olesiejuk currently owns a number of publishing houses in Poland, and Empik, which is the biggest chain of bookstore in Poland, also owns a major publishing group and produces their own books. So this is an interesting, some might say a dangerous development in the Polish book industry, but so it seems like this is kind of a trend right now. One thing to note also is that during the last few years, there's the importance of there's been a growing importance of online bookstores. In 2015 it was 30% of all book sales in Poland. We don't have Amazon in Poland. We don't have a single, player that could compare to Amazon. It's a very fragmented market with a lot of smaller bookstores that compete with each other a lot, basically trying to offer best prices. So they are the major competition to the wholesalers that basically are the companies that used to be the most powerful, maybe 5 or 6, are still very, very powerful, but, the only challenge to their power comes from the online bookstores right now. And, I think this is a situation that happens in pretty much every single country. Right now, basically, we see bookstores closing all over the country, and it's a trend that's basically been, going in the same direction for the past 20 years. So there isn't, that shouldn't be a huge surprise to anyone. The major bookstore chains are Empik, Matras, Book, Świat Książki, Książnica Polska, or Bookspan. Empik is probably the most influential right now. They have something, I think, more than 300 stores all across the country. And if a Polish publisher ever tells you that they need to know very, very quickly about something about the cover, or they need to have it approved because they are arranging a promotion with someone, that means they're talking to Empik and they're trying to get their books displayed in a favorable way at the Empik stores, once it's published, and for that they need to be able to present their project to people at Empik in order to make a good impression. So Empik is a very powerful company in Poland too, and for trade publishing, they are often the biggest trendsetters. And if a publisher can have their book well displayed in Empik bookstores, that's halfway to being successful with the book in Poland. Matras is a company that currently has some major problems, and we'll see if it survives this year or not. Świat Książki is, you might also know a publisher by this name. They also own some bookstores, basically. As far as translations and books in translations in Poland are concerned, translated books accounted for 1.5% of all books published in Poland in 2015, which is it's a fifth, and you have to keep in mind that that this includes all of the textbooks and all of the professional books that I've mentioned previously. So in the trade market, this is a very substantial proportion of books. The great majority of translations is obviously from the English language, and basically every single publishing house you will be working with by default assumes that they will be supplied with materials in English. French is actually second on the list with 9% of translations, so that's some good news maybe to those of you who publish books in French in Canada. That being said, I would very much recommend that you provide Polish publishers with some materials in English about your books, whether it's a full translation of the text, which is the optimal solution, or at least a translation of a fragment of the book, or at least description of what the book is about in English. That is incredibly helpful in getting your book noticed and seriously considered for publication in Poland. The reason is the majority of editors basically speak English themselves, but they usually don't speak French. So an average editor at a Polish publishing house is completely incapable of making any decisions about the text that's provided in French. What the editors do is they, hire, for example, some translator from the French language, and they send them the materials in French and ask them to read them and send them a report, what is called recenzja in Polish, which is like a review of the book, and based on this, the editor will make a decision whether to make an offer or not. But in order for the editor to become interested in a project, they need to have something that they will be able to understand themselves. This is why it's so important to be able to provide them with something in English. Fiction titles are the major part of all books in translations, about 53%. Academic books are only about 10% of translations, and so this is, the great majority of the Polish book market. I told you the biggest companies that, are on top of those lists, all of those companies combined accounts for 10% of all translations. And that figure seems slightly inflated somehow. I'm not sure what exactly this, the source that was taking those figures with considers academic books to be, but we don't really make a lot of business selling translation rights to academic texts. One thing to notice is that ratio of books by Polish authors to translated books can vary and does vary very dramatically between different genres of books. So, for example, in literary fiction, I would say the majority of books published in Poland are by Polish authors. I was looking for the statistic. I've seen it before, but I wasn't able to find it right now. I remember seeing a statistic of something like 70% of literary fiction titles are by Polish authors. Only 30% are translations. By contrast, thrillers is completely reversed. It's close to 80% are translations, and only about 20% are books by Polish authors. In children's literature, the vast majority of books published and especially literature for younger children, the vast majority of books published in Poland will be by Polish authors. Cookbooks is another example where I think Polish authors have a huge advantage over foreign authors. But so this varies a great deal, and before the end of my presentation, I will go kind of through different major genres of books, and I will tell you what specifically works and what doesn't in those genres, but something to keep in mind. So very, very brief, I have to start going faster. Very, very brief sort of background of Polish book industry. Basically, Poland was a communist country up until 1989, which means that prior to 1989, there were basically no publishing businesses in Poland. Polish communist government would basically have a certain amount of paper that they would distribute among their various publishing houses. There was a publisher that specialized in literary fiction, the publisher that specialized in children's books, etc. They would get, that much amount of paper, and they would have to produce a certain amount of books. Centrally planned economy. In '89, this all suddenly changes, and this is why the first fortunes are made in the Polish publishing industry. And there's lots of stories in the Polish publishing industry of people making their first trip to the London Book Fair, getting their buying a license for the first sort of major commercial novel, I don't know, by Stephen King or somebody like that, and selling it in some ridiculous print run of 600,000 copies in Poland. So those were the good old 90s. And back then, I think the name of the game was to publish as much as possible, as cheaply as possible, and as quickly as possible. You didn't care about marketing. You didn't care about producing high quality products. You wanted to have a lot of books produced cheaply, available on the market, so people would buy it. People were so hungry for commercial Western literature back then that you could sell anything, and in huge quantities, with very little effort. That has changed dramatically, I think, right now, and these days, basically this kind of business strategy is no longer feasible. There's a huge competition in the market, and there's a huge amount of books produced, and people are, as you've seen, few people are buying books. So there is a huge competition for attention of readers, and you have to basically do a good job as a publisher. You have to do a good job marketing your books and finding clients for your books. So this is the sort of the trajectory that most of those publishing houses would have gone through over the last 20 years or so, from basically produce cheaply and produce a lot to let's think about how we are going to make the best book possible. And a lot of leading publishing houses in Poland are, publishing houses that came up during the early 90s and are, a big presence in Polish book industry up until now. So what kind of a company is a typical Polish publishing firm? I think most people don't realize that most of the companies you are dealing with are very small companies. Even the large publishers by Polish standards would often be, publishing houses that have, maybe 20 or 25 people in the office. There's a huge amount of publishing houses that basically work, sometimes it's just a marriage, working out of their apartment and, while raising kids at the same time. So, that's something that you have to keep in mind, that those companies tend to be fairly small businesses. That being said, there are some, big and professional, large corporate-like publishing companies in Poland too, and I will go through, some specific examples later on. Again, as you develop your connections in Poland and you meet people, keep in mind that you will be either meeting with owners of the publishing house, and in many publishing houses, it is still the owners that basically call all the shots. You will often, actually communicate with either a foreign rights manager or like a secretary of the board or a secretary of the CEO, but these are people that don't really make any decisions, and all the decisions are made by the owners. So it's good to get to know the owners. The editors, I always laugh that editors in Poland are oftentimes not really editors, as in, they don't do line editing. I think many of the editors that you will meet, would be more appropriately described as sort of project managers. They basically oversee the entirety of work that goes into creating a book. They hire somebody to do line editing. They hire somebody to correct the books. They hire translators, etc. But they aren't directly involved with the text. That being said, there are obviously some exceptions. And editors you will basically see editors mostly at the bigger publishing houses in Poland. The smaller publishing houses tend to be either owners directly or working via some kind of rights manager, which is basically somebody who carries the messages to the owner and then back to you. And then rights managers, again, this is just somebody who's in charge of maintaining everything that goes along with licensing books. So they basically are responsible for contracts, for keeping track of, what are the active licenses, for sending, sample copies, for preparing royalty reports, etc., etc. But rights managers are basically they're usually not the people who make decisions whether to license a title or not. That being said, something to keep in mind. As you sell rights in Poland, you have to understand who it is exactly that you are dealing with. It's very useful to understand, and what is the structure of any particular publishing house that you are working with, because even if the editor is not making the decision herself or himself, you can help them influence the decision makers in the way that will be advantageous to you or to the project that you represent. For example, oftentimes the editors will have an editorial meeting to which they have to bring their ideas for books that might be published at their publishing house. So your job is to, as somebody who sells rights wants to sell rights to these publishing houses, to provide them with the sort of information and resources that will make it possible and easy for them to make the strongest case possible on behalf of the project that you are trying to sell. So this is, even if those people don't make decisions themselves, they very often big allies to you as you're trying to close the translation rights deal. Some general statistics about the Polish book market. Print runs, I think it's an interesting statistic to see that there is a growing number of titles, and growing very, very, quickly since 2011 to 2015. I have my own theory about this. I think this really represents 2011 was kind of the moment when there was a big crisis in Poland. It was a difficult year for the Polish book industry, and I think many publishing houses decided that publishing, buying cheap books from Polish authors and publishing those would be a good solution to their problems. And I think, since 2011, there's been a huge increase in numbers of books by Polish authors that ended up being published. But as there is a greater number of titles being published, the overall print run of those books is diminishing, and with it, obviously, the average print run is going down. I think the average print run of between around 3,000 copies is about right, I think, in Poland. But I would say that the price of books at about 10 euros, I think that's pretty expensive, and I think this is again the textbook market interfering with the statistics, because I would say that typical novel is priced at around 7 or 8 euros, and children's and young adult titles would be often priced even more aggressively. Poland in general as a market, unlike most of Western European markets to my knowledge, is a very price sensitive market, which means that if you overprice the book, that will have a huge impact on its sales. And again, going back to the statistics very early on, when I told you that the GDP in Poland is about a quarter of what it is in Western Europe, basically, people don't have as much disposable income, and people do look for a bargain when it comes to books. So something to keep in mind. If you were to calculate, assume a print run of 2,800 copies and a price of 981 in euros, you would end up with the value of royalties, assuming a standard 7% royalty rate of about 1,900 euros. So again, I think this price is a little bit higher than what it is, in reality. So this is kind of why you see what a typical sort of advance in Poland right now and tends to be kind of around 1,500 euros. I think this is okay, so it typically takes publishers about a year to publish a book from when they licensed the book. That being said, quite a few publishers will take a little bit longer because they will wait for the optimal time to publish a book, for example. And there are some specific publishing houses that like to have 24 months to publish a book because again, they're working on many projects at the same time, and they're building their list, looking far into the future. Znak is one of those publishers that likes to have a 24 months publishing term in their licenses, but I think this is pretty standard. As far as formats of the books are concerned, trade paperback is the most common publishing format in Poland. Hardcovers are very, very rarely published. I think it's something that happens only for very special books, and I don't think, which actually quite surprises me quite a bit, but we really don't have this kind of strategy like you see in the United States, for example, where you would first have the book published as a hardcover to take advantage of this part of the market that wants to have the book right now and is willing to pay a premium for this version of the book. Then sometime later a trade paperback, then sometime later a mass market paperback. In Poland, usually the first print run is just trade paperback, and that's what you have for the entire duration of the license. Mass market and pocket-sized paperbacks is something that's becoming a little bit more popular these days, and which is a very interesting development in Poland. But if somebody's really interested in this, I can talk about this later. But we are running a little bit late, so I'm just going to push on. I'm actually going to just go to the next slide because, I think there are more useful things later on in the presentation. Okay, so what you can expect as far as the translation rights offer is concerned in Poland. Advances, I would say anything from $1,000 to six-figure deals. Those happen in Poland. I'm not sure what the record is for the Polish translation rights, but it's probably something about I would imagine about $500,000 right now. for a book. It's so something like this is possible in exceptional cases. That being said, usually it will be much closer to $1,000-$1,500 for an advance. Maybe a little bit higher if you can get some kind of auction going and you have multiple publishers competing for a book. Royalties, I think the default, it used to be, well, the default royalty rate in Poland right now is about 7% of the retail price, or higher, if you have an escalating progressive royalty rate, and that would apply to both the print editions, and no distinction is made between hardcovers, paperbacks, and an audio edition that's on a physical on a CD. For ebooks and audio downloads, the standard rate is 25% of net receipts. The license typically lasts for 5 years, which is standard. The typical publication term is 18 months. I would encourage you to always grant territory world to when it comes to Polish licenses. You are not going to be able to sell Polish rights to somebody outside of Poland, so you might just as well give the license to a territory. I mean, the territory to set it to world in a license agreement. That arguably makes it possible for Polish publishers to sell Polish books. In the United States, there is a big community of Polish people living there, etc. Also, just something to keep in mind, not many people realize this, but it's actually a little bit problematic from a legal standpoint, to restrict territories of licensing agreements within the European Union, just because of the way the European Union is set up. Licenses or co-editions. Basically, in Poland, my experiences, and maybe there may be some specific companies that do like working with co-editions, but my experience is that if you expect to have a co-edition rather than a straight up license with a fee maybe for the production materials to a title, a co-edition is going to be a deal breaker for about 95% of the publishers, and 5% will likely consider it, but will decide it's a deal breaker afterwards. So if your business model is to try and do co-editions, whenever possible, try, but be flexible, because I've seen it hundreds of times that when a proprietor was determined to get a co-edition in Poland, and it just ended up resulting in no deal at all. So I think it's better to have a licensing deal which is a straight up license and charge the publisher for for production materials than not to have a deal at all. As far as charging for production files, materials is concerned, I think people expect that there might be a fee for supplying the production files. Usually I would say that if the fee is higher than about $300, maybe $400, beyond that, it gets almost impossible to get both publishers to agree to this, unless it's a very specific kind of project which basically relies very much on some kind of unique photographs or something. But typically, about $300 is an acceptable fee. One trick that you can do, I don't know if it's a trick, but what people do is basically if you charge for the service of supplying the production files to a publisher, and this is what you issue the invoice for, then you pay no tax on it. If your invoice is invoice for a license to use photos or some kind of graphical materials or something, then you basically have to pay the tax on it, because it's a royalty payment, and it's taxable. So it kind of makes sense to maybe grant a permission to use those materials to the publisher, without any charge, and then charge them for the service of preparing those files, recording them on DVDs and furnishing them to the publishers. Something that you should also you should know about when working in Poland, there will be a lot of Polish publishers that will make you if they make an offer for your book, they will suggest what's called either a wholesale price or a net price, or price to the trade. It has various different names in Poland, but it's basically a net price. It's basically what the publisher receives from a wholesaler or from a bookstore when they sell a copy of a book, rather than the price that's printed on the back cover of the book. And it would be quite typical to have a wholesale price, wholesale royalty rate of about 10%, while, as I mentioned earlier, the typical retail royalty rate is about 7%. Now, if you take into account that the wholesale price is usually about 50% of the retail price, that means that the 10% net royalty is equal to 5% retail royalty. So it's way below market standards. So I would basically insist on, we hardly ever agree to deals with wholesale net price royalties in them. Whether you can convince or talk a Polish publisher out of this, that's a whole different story. Some of them defend these types of royalties almost, to the point that it might be a deal breaker for them if you disagree, if you don't agree to these. But if you can, try to convince those publishers to offer royalties based on the retail price, because it's a much more steady, much more predictable source of royalty revenue. The problem with publishers is that they tend, with net or wholesale price royalties, is that publishers tend to discount the books very, very heavily later during the license, and once the book is discounted, you get the percentage on a discounted price, so you get much less in overall royalties. And if you keep the royalty raised as based on the retail price, you basically discourage the publisher from discounting the book too aggressively, which I think is a good thing. In either case, be vigilant about this and look exactly at what is in the offer that the Polish publisher is sending you, and if it doesn't say specifically what type of royalty it is and just mentions the royalty rate, ask and make sure, because I've seen it many times that authors and proprietors from United States and Poland will be very happy that they've gotten a very nice 10% royalty rate, but they didn't realize it was based on the wholesale price, so which was actually a very bad deal. This is if you work in Poland directly, this is going to be a major concern for you. Collecting royalty statements and payments. It's to the point that I know that a lot of publishers who work directly in Poland basically just focus on collecting the advance and forget about collecting royalty statements and payments. From our perspective, as as an agency, I think half of the royalty revenue we've received last year on behalf of our clients was from advances, and about half was in royalty payments. So it can be a very substantial source of royalty revenue. So it's good to stay on top of this. There will be a lot of publishing houses in Poland that will not have, they will be disorganized and will not be sending you royalty statements automatically. So it's a very sort of obvious advice to give, but stay on top of this. Know when those royalties are expected and keep track of this. And if somebody doesn't send you the statements, make sure that you remind them politely, but remind them. And in most cases, that will be actually all you need to do. If people still don't want to send them, then you can always threaten them with terminating the licensing agreements, which usually is a strong enough threat to make them send those statements. Collecting payments is a major problem. Here's the issue of tax certificates comes in, and sometimes it's not as easy as just invoicing the amount that came out in the royalty statements, because you still have to supply the publisher with a tax certificate, valid tax certificate that will allow them to make this payment with the reduced tax rate. And if you are not assertive about collecting payments, if you just issue the invoice and forget about it, you are very likely not to receive this payment for a very long time. There is a, it's part of the Polish business culture, unfortunately, that something called kultura niepłacenia. It's actually from the title of a newspaper article that, a while back, which is actually about empty stores. But there is this whole, somehow it's okay in Poland not to pay invoices on time, and it starts with, the bookstores, and then it goes to book wholesalers, and kind of moves on to book publishers, and in the end you are waiting for the payment sometimes many months after the payment was due. Anybody who's done a single licensing deal in Poland will probably know what I'm talking about. It's very rare in my experience the publisher will sort of consciously default on making payments, but if you're not assertive and if you're not chasing those payments very actively, you will be last in line to receive those payments, because other people are chasing those payments, and publishers will always, make those, pay those people that make the biggest fuss. The ebook market, very, very quickly. I'll basically just skip it. If somebody has questions about it, ask me later. But there is no ebook market in Poland, or it's not big enough to really warrant any major discussion, in my opinion. It's tiny. I would say, I always say to my colleagues from the United States who complain about Amazon, there are also disadvantages of not having Amazon, because Amazon has essentially created, in my opinion, the ebook market in the United States. Poland is a wonderful example of the fact that the ebook market doesn't emerge spontaneously once technology makes it possible. It's a completely different discussion, but basically, ebooks are not going to be a major stream of revenue for you in Poland, with one exception, and I should point this out. We actually do work with some academic and professional titles, for example, with some computer and IT books, etc. And on those books, ebook royalties can be actually a substantial proportion of overall royalty payments. So, there are obviously exceptions to every rule. The audiobook market, again, it's actually smaller than the ebook market right now, so it's tiny at the moment, but it's as of in comparison to, or in contrast to the ebook market, it's growing much more quickly. So and I expect it will actually overtake the ebook market within the next 5 years or so. So I think generally it's to your advantage. I mean, it's to your advantage to grant both ebook rights and audio rights if you can grant those rights in the agreement. It's going to be some additional royalty revenue. It does open some additional avenues for promoting the books. I'm not going to get into this, but it's so it's helpful, and who knows, it might make a small difference. But right now, the audio market is basically just audio downloads, thanks to this one company called Audioteka, which is the biggest audiobook distributor in Poland right now, and they're also responsible for recording and creating a lot of audiobooks. They've added a huge list of audio titles in Poland over the last 3-4 years, and they're doing adding more and more every single year. So they're a major presence, and this is a market that's very interesting to watch. So I'll mention some of the main Polish publishing houses very, very quickly. These are not necessarily in the order of the biggest to the largest, but I'll just go through them. Snack Publishing Group, one of my favorite publishers to work with in Poland. Whenever I can work with them, they can be really, really picky when it comes to the books that they license, and they can be quite demanding. And when it comes to making the authors available for promotion, for interviews, etc. They also have very high expectations when it comes to books. So they basically, and if the book doesn't meet those expectations, they can be quite brutal about their decisions about the future of a given author, for example, at their publishing house. But overall, I think they're one of the best all-round publishing houses in Poland. Foxal is the publishing group that's owned by Empik, which is the chain of bookstores that I told you about. Some years, maybe 3-4 years ago, they bought 3 publishing houses: WAB, Buchmann, and Bilga. These are, if you've been working in the publishing in translation rights market for a while, you probably know these names. Right now, they're basically just imprints of Foxal Publishing Group. It took them a long while, I think, to merge the 3 publishing houses together into a sort of coherent and well-working unit. But they're definitely a force to be reckoned with. They publish a lot of titles. They're quite strong when it comes to young adult titles, literary titles, color nonfiction. So again, a good publisher to work with in Poland. Publicat Publishing Group is, again, this was one of the number 10, I think, on the list of the biggest publishing companies in Poland in terms of revenue. Famous for being, for example, the publisher of J.K. Rowling right now, and Stephanie Meyer in the past, and the Twilight books have sold some insane number of copies in Poland. They have various imprints. They basically publish the entire range of books, from fiction, commercial fiction, literary fiction, to young adult and children's books and nonfiction titles. Pruszyński Media is, again, one of those publishing houses that came up in the 90s. Pruszyński is the surname of the founder, like in many cases, actually, with Polish publishing houses. I should actually mention this. Just, I don't know, maybe it'll make it easier for you to remember those companies. Znak in Polish means sign, or and they're associated historically with a magazine that's kind of a religious magazine in Poland. Foxal is just the name of a street where their office used to be located. It's no longer located there, which is kind of amusing, but it's a famous street in Warsaw. Publicat, it doesn't mean anything in particular. Pruszyński is the name of the founder, though he's no longer, he's a still major shareholder in the company, but he doesn't run the day-to-day business of the company. Again, good all-around publishing house focusing on commercial fiction, commercial women's fiction, I think, is they're particularly strong. They have a particularly strong list in that area. They're also one of the few publishing houses in Poland that will publish popular science. They publish some fantasy books as well and science fiction books, but they used to be much stronger in that area in the past. They're kind of moving away from this right now. Zysk, again, the name of the owner, Zysk, it actually means profit in Poland, which is a good name, I guess. This is, again, one of those publishing houses that came up during the early 90s. They're from Poznań. They're actually very strong when it comes to publishing books by Polish authors, but they also publish some very important authors in translation. George R.R. Martin, for example, is their author. Very also a fairly strong nonfiction list. Very good publisher to work with. Helion Group, or Helion as we call them in Poland, is probably the biggest commercial nonfiction publisher in Poland at the moment. They're pretty much the monopolist when it comes to computer and IT books, and this is kind of where they came from. But right now they publish the whole range of nonfiction titles, of trade nonfiction titles, including business titles, educational titles. They also publish some fiction titles right now. PWN Group is another big major nonfiction publisher in Poland. Various imprints. I would say that they sort of, one of their legs is in the professional academic sort of textbook publishing world, and one of their legs is in the trade publishing world. They publish medical books, they publish academic books, they publish some computer books and IT books. They used to publish fiction. Dom Wydawniczy, PWN, was their sort of trade fiction imprint, but that project didn't work out very well, so they refocused right now on publishing nonfiction. Wydawnictwo Literackie is one of those publishing houses that actually existed during the communist era. And I told you that those, there were different publishing houses that were assigned different roles within, I'm oversimplifying things, but Wydawnictwo Literackie means the literary publishing house, and their role has always been publishing literary fiction. And this is what they continue to do, and very successfully until today. I think this is one of the most prestigious imprints in Poland, or publishing houses in Poland, when you are a Polish author and and you write literary fiction. But this is a great publishing house, and really like working with them. This is a very strong brand in Poland, very highly respected, and it's always people always take notice. They don't publish a lot of titles. They are very selective, and people always pay close attention to what Literackie is doing and who they are publishing. So if you can work with them, that's a nice opportunity. Muza is a general fiction and non-fiction publisher. Again, a publishing house that came up during the 90s. Muza means muse. I think they're quite well known in Poland for publishing classics of world literature. They also have a pretty big focus on books by authors who write in languages other than English. But I would say not really French, maybe, mostly a lot of Spanish authors, and they also publish, Murakami, for example, Japanese authors. They have a fairly strong, non-fiction list at the moment. Marie Kondo, the book about cleaning, is I think their latest big bestseller when it comes to non-fiction titles. Rebis is a publishing house from Poznań. Again, it's a publishing house that came out during the 90s. I would say a very good general trade publisher that publishes both fiction and non-fiction. They publish some literary fiction. They publish some commercial fiction. They have a very nice and strong and growing list of fantasy and science fiction books. And they publish some business titles. And this is one of those publishing houses where you will be working directly with the owner usually, if you are meeting somebody from Rebis. Nasza Księgarnia is kind of like Wydawnictwo Literackie, is one of those publishing houses that predates the sort of modern era of 90s capitalism. This was the publishing house that existed during the communist era in Poland and even before that. But this is one of the most recognizable brands in Poland when it comes to children's books, and this is basically the almost exclusively these days. They almost exclusively focus on children's books, and they publish a lot of books by Polish authors, but also some titles in translations. They also publish some books, non-fiction titles. Some cookbooks. They publish some books on animals, for example. The Street Cat Bob, and similar stories like this. It's a great publisher to work with on children's titles. They are the Polish publisher of Jeff Kinney, for example, and they've been hugely successful with Jeff Kinney in Poland for many years. Very very good publisher to work with if you have an opportunity to work with them. Świat Książki is a company that basically was owned by many different owners throughout the years. It used to be the Polish Bertelsmann company. It used to be owned by Weltbied, and currently is basically again, publishes under their original name Świat Książki, which means the world of books. This is a commercial publisher with focus on commercial fiction and some non-fiction, but I think their strongest suit is commercial fiction. Polish publisher of The Girl on the Train right now, Polish publisher of hugely popular Jojo Moyes. So they've had a pretty incredible 2016. It was a very good year for them, and 2015 also. And again, a great name for commercial fiction. Wydawnictwo Sonia Draga. Sonia Draga is the owner of the company and the person who basically runs everything there. She is the Polish publisher of Dan Brown, for example, E.O. James. Kind of has a list that's split between, on one hand, extremely commercial titles, like Dan Brown or E.O. James, and on the other hand, very, very literary books. So basically anything that Ms. Draga finds interesting and valuable and and worthwhile she is likely to publish. Wydawnictwo Sonia Draga also recently bought a children's publishing house called Debit, and so they also publish children's books right now. HarperCollins Polska is they only started, being present in the Polish market quite recently, so we don't really know how to describe them or how to judge them. We'll see, but so far they're proving very, very capable at publishing commercial fiction. I know that they are building a non-fiction list right now also, so this is definitely a company to follow closely and to see what they are going to do in the future. And Czarna Owca, one of the publishers that I like to work with a lot. The name means black sheep. The name basically means or refers to the fact that they still are often willing to publish books that on controversial and difficult and important in their opinion topics that other publishers in Poland are too afraid to publish. Poland tends to be a very conservative market when it comes to things like gay rights and other things. So Czarna Owca is one of those publishers that was happy to publish books on difficult subjects like this in the past. They are also very well known in Poland for publishing Scandinavian fiction. Polish publisher of Stieg Larsson, Kamila Lackberg, who are very, very popular authors in Poland. They are very good general, all-round fiction and non-fiction publisher that I think has been becoming much stronger. Has been becoming stronger every year for quite a long time now. So this is definitely a publisher it's very good to work with if you have an opportunity. A quick discussion of role of sub-agents in Poland, because basically all of agents in Poland are sub-agents, pretty much. I mean, we could find some agents, but all the major companies are sub-agents. I would actually say that the Polish market is a very, what I would call a sub-agent market. It's a highly fragmented market where you have to work with a lot of different publishers, which is one of the reasons why sub-agents tend to do well here, because there is a premium for being an expert in this particular market. It's large enough. The market is large enough to support a lot of sub-agencies, but it's not large enough to cause the biggest powers in the publishing industry to sort of develop direct expertise in the market as such. So as a result, you have quite a lot of sub-agencies operating on the market and competing quite fiercely with each other, which again kind of makes them improve all the time and do things better all the time. So in other words, I think it's this may be where my bias shows, but I think it may be kind of tricky to try and work directly in the Polish market just because of the strong sub-agent presence. And, as a result of this fierce competition between sub-agents, typical Polish editor receives, 30, 40 specific suggestions with regards to the books they might want to consider for their list. So the editors are constantly bombarded with highly targeted, suggestions and offers and proposals. So if you are going to send out one mailing to Poland once a month, that's likely to get lost in the noise, basically. The main sub-agents in Poland are Graal, obviously my company, Book Club, which used to be the Polish division of Andrew Nürnberg company, but there was some kind of a disagreement there, so they split and they decided to become a separate company. There is a new franchise of Andrew Nürnberg's agency in Poland operating on the market right now, with one of my ex-colleagues from Graal, colleagues from Graal running this agency right now. Anna Jarota is, I think, a French agency originally that also has an office in Poland, and again, one of the ex-Graal agents is running this agency in Poland right now, and Macadamia again is a smaller agency that's run by 3 ex-Graal agents. So there's quite a lot of Graal has this. Graal is probably the only agency in Poland right now that also hires new people and trains new people and basically gives a chance to a lot of new people all the time, and so there's a lot of people who have had experience working at Graal, also at Graal or in many publishing houses in Poland, and also in many agencies. Other agencies that work in the Polish market that you should know also is Prawa i Prewody. This is a Serbian agency run by Anna Milenkovic, and Marché agency is a British agency that also operates directly in the Polish market, and ILA, Intercontinental Literary Agency, is another agency that operates in Poland from the UK. I'm sure there are others. I think these are the main ones. And maybe I can talk very, very quickly to a difference, what I think the difference between agents and sub-agents, because if you do hire a sub-agent, or if you're thinking of hiring a sub-agent, it's very important that you know what is about the sub-agent. So I know that some people don't like the term sub-agents. I personally like it, or I think it's useful to make a distinction between agents and sub-agents. Sub-agents, if an agent is a boutique that basically takes a raw material of a text and begins to shape it into the product that it will eventually become. Sub-agent is like a wholesaler that basically works with products that are almost ready and works with a lot of them and quite quickly. And so their role is basically to add value, which is their expertise in the local market, to the product, not to develop the raw material as a product. So if you expect a sub-agent to do an agent's job, you are likely to be very disappointed with them, because that's basically something that they are typically not very good at. That being said, a good sub-agent will be able to double as an agent every once in a while when the situation calls for it. But most sub-agents, you basically give them what they need to work with, which is basically a product that has been pretty much prepared for translation rights market, and allow them to basically use their market expertise to get you the best deal possible for this particular product. It's obviously a very condensed version of the story, but we are running short on time. So advantages of working with a sub-agent, very, very quickly. They're market specialists. They basically know all these 300, 400 companies. They've worked with them. They know the people. They know how they are structured internally. They know who to talk to there in order to get the decision. They know who is going to potentially cause problems when it comes to payments, royalty statements. They know how to get the statements and payments out of them. So this is all that basically goes into being a specialist in the market. They bridge the language gap, which is hugely important. And, most people who work at publishing houses and work in translation rights do speak English, but very many of those people are not very comfortable speaking English. So they actually prefer to work with a sub-agent, because that allows them to basically speak in Polish about those projects. The sub-agents generally will do active selling. I mean, a good sub-agent, a bad sub-agent will just sit on various projects and wait until somebody gets in touch with them about it. A good sub-agent will be basically pushing the project they work on at any given moment very, very actively, and will try to find the best publisher for any given project. And this is where I think the good sub-agents are distinguished from bad sub-agents. I think bad sub-agents will tend to be satisfied with getting a deal. I think a good sub-agent will always try to get a sort of deal that will eventually make the book successful in Poland, or will increase the chances of a book to be successful in Poland. So basically, it's a matter of pairing a right sort of project with the right sort of publisher, oftentimes. The best vehicle for getting the best deal possible for a book is to submit it very widely to a lot of publishers and get people to basically compete over who gets to publish it in Poland. Auction is the best vehicle to get to get a high offer. You know, I've often worked on deals that started with an initial offer of $1,000 and ended up with, you know, $60,000, $70,000, so or much higher than this actually. So if you can get the right group of publishers interested in the project and competing over it, you know, you can get some very good results from the Polish market. And as I mentioned earlier, they can be extremely useful when it comes to collecting royalty statements and payments. Disadvantages of working with a sub-agent: they can be a barrier of your getting to know the market directly. I think that will be a bad sub-agent who kind of creates themselves as a barrier between you and the market. I think when it's a good sub-agent, you are a team that you work together, but I'm not always sure how other sub-agents work. I imagine that this could be a possibility. They charge a commission, you know, which is obviously a downside. That being said, I think a good sub-agent will easily make up for the commission with just getting you more and better deals. By the way, my bias obviously shows here, so you just keep that in mind. You know, I do believe that it's better to work with a sub-agent than to work directly. Sub-agents can be too busy or overworked. Again, they work on a number, you know, a lot of projects. I mentioned earlier that I've done thousands of licensing deals in Poland in my time at Grau. It's not unusual, but you know, it can be a very different pace of working than what, you know, somebody who works on this, I know, maybe 20 or 30 titles does and expects. So just something to keep in mind. If you feel like your books are not getting the attention they deserve from the sub-agents, it's probably time to, you know, fire them or look for somebody else, or maybe have a serious conversation with them. It's possible that their specific expertise is not a particularly good match for your specific list. So, you know, just be aware of this, and a good sub-agent will let you know that, you know, I won't be able to help you with this. And obviously, as in any profession, you know, some sub-agents are just better than others. And I should mention about scouts. I think it's an interesting development of, you know, the last few years in Poland, very, very quickly. In the past, nobody had a scout in Poland. Right now, I think for 8 of the major publishing houses that basically compete for the biggest fiction titles in Poland hire scouts, and here's a link if you want to see who exactly is scouting for whom in Poland. But the result of the effect of this is that we suddenly started to receive much more preemptive offers in Poland, and you know, there is a big competition between those bigger sort of publishing houses that specialize in commercial fiction. You know, they try to get in as early as possible, and they try to get the book off the market, you know, if they are convinced that this could be something for them. So it's an interesting development, because in the past, Polish publishers tended to wait very long, often until the book was published in the original market, before actually deciding on whether to make an offer or not. But this is something that has changed. Some general comments about how to build your translation rights list. And, you know, I don't have a lot of time. I thought I would be able to say something more about this, but I will just go through this very, very briefly. Basically, keep in mind that not every single book is suited for the translation rights market, and only a small subset of the books that will be published in Canada, in the US, and in the UK will ever get translated into Polish. So it's important to invest your time and effort into the titles that are likely to work for translation rights market. What titles to focus on? I think there's obviously exception to this rule, but I think what publishers look for in titles in translation success stories above everything else. You know, you are unlikely to find a publisher in Poland for that, you know, extremely well, interesting, creative, innovative, experimental literary novel that you've licensed and published because you love it so much. You know, this is a title that's unlikely to work here. What's worked very well here is the title that's been the backbone of your list for many years, and you've been selling on regular basis in large quantities every year, and you are doing a 3rd edition of it already for your market. You know, that's a good title to focus on translation. What works is a title that has been licensed in other markets, and I say pretty much anything that has been licensed in 3 or 4 different markets should work in Poland, in principle. I think it's a mistake to just focus on your front list when thinking about the translation rights list. I think there are often gems sitting and sort of dormant in your backlist. So I think it's a good practice in general to have maybe a frontlist catalog or rights catalog and a backlist rights catalog. And you basically want to separate the backlist from the front list, because you also don't want to overwhelm a person with, a catalog that has 100 titles, because nobody will look through it, basically. Too long didn't read, I think, is what they say in the internet. So you want to have a sort of highlights and current titles, some kind of hot list, a front list, but you also want to have a resource, which is basically a list of your backlist titles, so that's complete with all the information that people require in order to start making decisions about whether this is something for us or not. When you create a rights list or a catalog, I think it's extremely important to basically demonstrate those success stories that you are hopefully have on your rights list. So what is a success story? What are the measures of a success story? Number of translation rights sold around the world. You should always update your catalog with the latest about this. There is not a greater factor in getting a translation rights deal all around the world than having a long list like this title has been already sold in 6 countries, 7 countries. This is the number one argument that you can use, that everybody understands. In political science, there's this idea called the bandwagoning effect. This is what you use in international relations. I think the bandwagoning effect definitely occurs in the translation rights industry, and and you can get this sort of this type of sort of hype-driven dynamic going, where everybody wants to get this title that everybody else is licensing in all the other countries. And if you can make this happen, that's usually a great thing, and you can close a lot of good translation rights deals as a part of this dynamic. So always put information about translation rights sold for the previous books by the author, option publishers. That's always good to include. Second thing I would also consider including is if you have impressive looking sales figures from your market or maybe other markets, that might be also good to include. Last but not least, attending the book fairs. It's hugely important. Personal relationships are the backbone of this industry, and I think it's very difficult to make translation rights deals without knowing people in person. I'm a huge believer in cultivating relationships with people and with editors and owners of publishing houses, and being attentive to understand what it is, what they are looking for, what it is that they need. So you can not only sort of approach them with any title that you have available for sale, but you can approach them with titles that just might work very well for their list specifically, given their specific interest, given their success stories from the past, given what they are looking for at any given moment. And this is what the book fairs are for. You are supposed to get to know the people as people. You can use this time to develop your familiarity with their publishing house, with their history, and basically put yourself in a position that you will be able to have more successful conversations and relations with them when it comes to selling translation rights. Here is a quick slide about the Polish book fairs if you were thinking about attending a book fair in Poland. There are 2 major book fairs, either Warsaw Book Fair or the Krakow Book Fair. Neither of those fairs, just keep in mind, is particularly focused on translation rights. Of the 2, I think Warsaw Book Fair is arguably more focused on translation rights, but it's still nothing compared to London or Bologna or Frankfurt. For example, in Warsaw Book Fair, the rights center is basically a tiny little room with maybe like 6 tables, and 2 of those are taken up by Graal, and basically they all taken up by Polish sub-agents. So sometimes there is one agency from London that comes, for like one of the days. Most people who attend Polish book fairs, as far as the industry is concerned, is just the salespeople. This is basically a big, fair in the old sense. People actually go to book fairs in Poland to buy books. So you have sales staff from different publishing houses basically selling discounted books all the time. And sometimes, editors or people who license translation rights will not even come to those fairs. So, but most Polish publishers, most important Polish publishers, travel to London and Frankfurt, and sometimes also Bologna when you specialize in children's books. So it's good to try and set up appointments with them for those book fairs. Are we doing on time? Very quickly, how to get a best deal for your book. submit to as many publishers as possible, and once you receive first offer for the book, try to organize an auction. Try to organize a bidding competition between different publishers, in order to elevate the level of the offer. So the typical auction in Poland, we start with one publisher making a single offer, and we will then send out an email with information about this specific offer, with details of this specific offer to all the other publishers that have expressed interest in the book previously, and we will usually set a deadline for any counter offers. And what usually happens is that people tend to keep the royalty rates at the level that they were in the original offer, but just improve the advance. So when you're negotiating the initial offer and you are thinking about organizing an auction down the road, just make sure that you get the good royalty rates. You're likely to get your advance improved as a part of the auction, but you will likely get stuck with royalty rates that were in the original offer. And I am a huge believer, and I think it's very important to have good royalty rates in licensing agreements, because if the book becomes hugely successful and you forgot to negotiate a good royalty rate, you will have lost a whole lot of money. Don't always go for the best monetary offer. Again, if you have an author that has a backlist of 20 titles, and if you sell one of his books to a publisher that will completely botch his publication in Poland, and you will have basically killed any possibility of publishing any of the backlist titles in Poland for the foreseeable future. So sometimes it's better to accept a lower offer that's from a publisher that is arguably better fit for a given title than just to go for the highest offer. That being said, the monetary, what people are willing to invest in a license is usually is quite telling in terms of what their plans are for the book and how many copies they hope to sell. Use every single translation right deal to improve your relationships with specific publishers. That's, it's a no-brainer, but, make a conscious effort to do it. I would say in Poland also respect option publishers. So if somebody has published a book by a given author, don't make an auction for a second book by this author. That will basically, even other publishers that might take part in this auction will not think it was a good thing to do. There's a sort of tacit agreement that publishers of specific authors should be allowed to publish other books by these authors. That being said, if you think that it's important from a perspective of the client or your author to be moved to a different publishing house, you have to make that decision. You have to move them. Very quickly, once a licensing agreement is signed, approvals. My general advice is basically assume that the publisher knows what they are doing in terms of covers, advertisements, and translating. You have no means really to judge the quality of a translation. Beware of the situations where you have an author who has a friend who speaks Polish, and this friend says the translation is really awful. And so you should basically try to side on the publisher side, I think, in situations like this, even though it's slightly counterintuitive. I guarantee you that these type of sort of opinions of various friends who speak Polish are very unreliable. Generally, as a general rule of thumb, I think approve the cover that the publisher has created for the Polish edition of the book. They know their market better than you do, and they know what cover is likely to lead to better sales. Advertisement, that's your call. If you think, if you think that, publisher is trying to take advantage of the brand name of your author, feel free to veto the idea of advertisement. That's more of that's a slightly different situation. Patronaty medialne is something that will always come up if you actually do licensed book in Poland. I would call it media partnerships. In Polish promotional books, it's a very common practice. Basically, it's a kind of barter agreement between a media company and a publisher. The media company gets a logo of their company on the back cover of the book, and the publisher gets special treatment through the media outlets of the specific media company. It's almost always, no sort of reservations in the author's to the author's advantage to agree to this. Whenever you can, try to convince your authors to come and visit Poland and do media interviews if only possible. That goes a long way towards strengthening the author's brand in Poland. I think the most successful authors in the Polish market are those who have come here very often, who have paid attention to the readers in Poland, who have given interviews, have been supportive of their Polish publishers, and it's a good practice if possible. Again, stay on top of royalty statements, on payments, stay on top of having the latest tax certificate available all the time. Stay on top of agreement expiration dates and suggest renewal of a license to a publisher. The publishers are likely to forget that the license is about to expire, and they are likely to forget that it has expired, and they will likely to still sell books after the license expires. It's not through some kind of cheating. They just don't have the infrastructure which allows them to track this kind of information. So I think it's your job or your sub-agent's job to stay on top of this. And the big question, what to do when things go wrong? Well, we don't really have that many options. If you're a big company that has a lot of strong titles, you have a strong leverage on any publisher to basically you can threaten them to A, cancel their licensing agreement, B, blacklist them, make it impossible for them to license book from you. So you do what you can basically to get what you want and resolve the issue. Again, a sub-agent can be very helpful here because, for example, my company, Grau, since we do so many licensing deals, no publisher in Poland can really afford to be blacklisted by us. So we have, and pretty much, most sub-agents to lesser or greater extent have this kind of leverage over any publishers, like to basically get publishers to resolve whatever issue that is being an issue. Current trends in Polish trade publishing. Thrillers and crime fiction is huge. Thanks to The Girl on the Train. Everybody since Frankfurt has been looking for the new Girl on the Train book and has been, in my opinion, overpaying for a lot of thrillers and crime fiction novels. But, those of you who work in translation rights, you probably have seen the same phenomenon in other countries, and you probably have your own opinions about this. But it's true that thrillers have been some of the most popular books that we've been offering to Polish publishers in recent months, maybe over a year. I think commercial women's literature is always strong, but some things work better than others. If some things are very, very country culture specific, these things usually don't travel well. For example, in the United States, you'll have like Western romance. That's something that's not going to translate very well because it talks about the aspirations of a very specific group of women that are not necessarily translatable into aspirations of women in Poland. And so you have to be careful about, distinguishing between the titles that have this sort of universal translation rights potential and those that will just do well for your market. I've seen it actually a lot of times. Some of the most successful commercial women's literature books in given countries are those that actually are very difficult to translate because I think it's something specific about this genre. Literary fiction, there's always a market for the icons of literary fiction and the biggest books in this genre. I think the market for sort of alternative, independent, smaller, sort of quirky, experimental literary fiction is very difficult as far as translation rights are concerned, especially in Poland. It might be different in different markets, but in Poland it's a very difficult market. Fantasy and science fiction has good potential in Poland, and if you have a strong list of fantasy and science fiction titles, the whole idea is basically you have to know which specific publishing houses to work with because there's a specific group of publishing houses in Poland that publish books in this genre, but these are popular books in Poland, and I think any sort of genre literature in principle works well in translation because it provides sort of a generic universal frame of reference which is not culture or country specific. So those work very well. Young adult fiction is a very big market in Poland, and it works very well. And again, genre literature within young adult fiction, so young adult fantasy, young adult science fiction, that tends to work well. Realistic young adult fiction, we kind of get into the same sort of problem that I mentioned with commercial women's literature. Sometimes what's realistic about those novels is so culture or country specific that it basically gets lost in translation. Middle grade works in Poland ever since the huge success of Jeff Kinney and Wimpy Kid books, but I think that there is a huge amount of middle grade titles available for licensing in general right now. So it's really just the strongest titles in this genre that are likely to get translated. Picture books, I will put it very, very bluntly, forget about it. You're very unlikely to license any picture books in Poland, at least to general trade publishing houses. I mean, it's something very weird about the Polish market, but we literally license 3-4 picture books a year, so it's an extremely difficult market. Biographies, very, very popular in Poland, but again, the stars have to be, for translation rights, these have to be biographies by huge global stars. You'll be surprised, but some of the biggest books in the United States, and I follow the United States market very, very closely. Like, for example, famous Saturday Night Live comedians, Amy Poehler, Tina Fey, huge books in the United States, untranslatable into Polish because nobody knows who they are. We represent book by Eddie Izzard right now, who is one of my personal heroes, and very difficult to find a publisher who would be willing to license Eddie Izzard biography or autobiography in Poland just because people don't know who those people are. So, but if you have Axl Rose, or, autobiography, you will likely be able to license it in Poland. So it has to be somebody who is known all around the world. History books work very well, especially if they're on topics which are of interest to Polish readers, which means basically the 20th century, the Second World War, First World War, not so much. Very difficult to license in Poland. If there is any Polish element in those history books, that's even better. That makes it possible to sell them. Business books, possible to sell them. You won't get very big deals for them. Usually, in the range of $1,000, $1,500, and you have to know which specific publishers work with these types of books. I think there is a bit of a trend right now for nature, environment, ecology books going on in Poland right now. But again, these have to be fairly exceptional titles, and there has to be something unique about them, something special, and something that would be possible to relate to the type of nature that you encounter in Poland. Interactive journals, books. By this I mean something like Regis Journal by Carrie Smith. That was one of the best-selling books in Poland in the last few years. And so right now, every single book that you can use as a kind of notebook and write stuff inside of a book is somehow hugely popular with Polish publishers, and it continues. This doesn't. I think the coloring books that were really, really popular maybe 2 years ago, there's basically no longer a market for this in Poland. But the interactive books continue to be popular. Religious books are very popular in Poland, but you have to know the very specific market for religious publishers, which is a kind of almost like a separate market that exists to the side of the standard trade publishing market. So, but it's definitely possible. Health, diet, fitness, including cookbooks. Those books work, but again, cookbooks tend to be quite difficult because anything to do with food, I think, tends to be a little bit country-specific and doesn't always translate very well. Color nonfiction can work, but if you have very expensive books, very expensive fancy albums with photos, that's something that's unlikely to work in Poland. That's very brief version of this. If you have any specific questions, I'm not sure if we will have time to answer everything, but we can maybe give those questions to Christy, and I will answer later by email, or we can set up a Skype conversation, something like this. I wanted to show you some of instead of talking about trends, I wanted to show you some of the books that have been awarded for the MPIC Bestseller Award in Poland right now. It's a unique award, book award in Poland, in the sense that it's actually based on actual sales figures. in Empik Bookstore, and since Empik Bookstore is the biggest chain of bookstores in Poland, this is actually a very sort of objective. It will give you a very objective sense of what books have been most popular in particular categories in Poland last year. So I will just make some general comments. So this is this category. I just screenshotted it from their website. It's called Books in Translation. So you can see Giorgio Moyes. This is the book that was published in 2016. By the way, this is all books that have been published in 2016. So, The Girl on the Train was still very popular this year, but was published earlier, so it's not included on this list. Just keep it in mind. But Giorgio Moyes is a huge success in Poland this year. I think the original title of this one is Small Life. This is not a title we represent, so I'm not sure what it was called, but it was also did very well in Poland. Published by wydawnictwo WAB or Grupa Foxal. This is published by Znak. Harlan Coben is very popular in Poland for many years. So his new book is popular in Poland. He's an established author here, published by Albatros. Nicholas Sparks is super popular in Poland, and again published by Albatros. And this is his new books, and it's not surprising to me that it's popular this year. Although we've actually worked on a sort of mass market kiosk project with Nicholas Sparks' book this year, and I think this might have contributed to this book being so popular this year. And obviously Robert Galbraith or J.K. Rowling, published by Dolnośląskie. And you'll forgive me, but out of these, I have to mention this, out of these 5 titles, 3 are books represented by Grau, so we're very proud of this. So Giorgio Moyes, Harlan Coben, and Nicholas Sparks. So this is non-fiction literature, and you will see hugely dominated by Polish authors. And this is actually, 2 religious books here. You will see this tends to be a very strong category in Poland. So these are just basically Polish authors, and this is very typical for non-fiction. This is one title that is translated from German. It's called The Secret Life of Trees, I think, the English title. I'm not sure what it is in German. Published by Otwarte, which is imprint of Znak. Also a book represented by Grau. This is young adult category. So very popular category of books in Poland. Obviously Harry Potter is not a surprise. Kierakas is hugely popular in Poland. This is, I think, the 5th book in the series by this author. Becca Fitzpatrick, also very popular for many years in Poland. Rick Riordan, super popular in Poland for many years. And this is the sort of the new Stephanie Meyer novel that is basically a rewrite of Twilight. Here everything except for J.K. Rowling is books represented by Grau again. So we are again very proud. This is children's books, which means anything below young adult titles, and you will see this is again the category that's typically dominated by Polish authors. The only exception is Jeff Kinney. This is the latest Wimpy Kid book published by Nasza Księgarnia, as I mentioned earlier. Again, in children's books, the younger the age group, the age of children, the more books, the more Polish authors, the more important the Polish authors are. But young adult, as you've seen, it's almost exclusively books by foreign authors. I'll just skip that because we don't really have time to go through this. This is actually actual bestsellers list. We don't actually have a sort of publicly known bestsellers list, so this is kind of a bit of an insider information. This is best-selling books at Empik stores in the last 3 weeks of December, which is basically the height of the pre-Christmas sales season. This is every single publisher is aiming to get their books to be very popular during that period of time. So that kind of shows you what has been doing very well in Poland. And this is number 1 is Hygge, which is a huge hit, a huge trend in Poland. It continues up until this year. I'm not sure if you've heard about these books, but it's basically a Danish lifestyle sort of titles about how to find happiness in your life. This is a project that I've personally been working on since very early in the year on behalf of Penguin UK, and we're super proud that this was actually the most best-selling book in Poland in the pre-Christmas period. obviously Girl on the Train, Harry Potter, which is not surprising. I think this is called Light Between the Oceans. By the way, this is another title that Graal has sold in Poland, Girl on the Train. Zniszczeń Dziennik, which is an amazing success story in Poland, which is Regda's Journal by Carrie Smith. This is a special edition that was published in time for Christmas with a different cover this year. This is a book that sold 500,000 copies in Poland since 2015. This is again, book that we worked on. Very, very proud of this success, and it's amazing that 2 years after initial publication, it's still one of the top-selling books in Poland. Secret Life of Trees, Miss Peregrine. Clarkson is super popular in Poland. Here's Nicholas Sparks, that I already mentioned before. Jojo Moyes, this is the movie tie-in edition of one of her books. Bridget Jones, Helen Fielding is obviously a very popular author in Poland for many years. Paulo Coelho is a super popular author in Poland for many, many years. So these are the kind of mainstays of the Polish book market. Here is again Jana Gihara, The Small Life. This is I forget what the English title is of this book, but it's the same cover as in the US edition, so I'm sure some of you recognize this. This is Nightingale, I think, by Kristin Hanna, and Shantaram by this is an older title, I believe, and that became very, very popular in Poland this year, published by Margines. I have to say they've done a very good job with this. So just some general statistics. 16 out of 40 titles on this list in general were translations, which means didn't include the Polish books here, but 24 books on the top 40 were by Polish authors. That kind of shows you a proportion translations to Polish authors, and 11 out of 16 translations were fiction titles. So the fiction titles are much more likely to become super popular in Poland. And that's it. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. So thank you.